just talk about the really strange, whether we're talking about objects in the sky or beings on the ground, there's always three explanations given for the source. Either it's from outer space, from some other dimension, or creations from a breakaway society, possibly escaped Nazis or the more typical corporate alphabet agency black projects. But I mean, given your vast exposure to these things, can you break down what we're seeing? Do you think it's all three? Is it one more than the other? What's going on here, man?
Well, two of the three are the same thing, and let me explain what I mean. If there's a civilization visiting Earth, and there are a number of them, that are from other star systems,
Mm-hmm.
in order to get here, they are, by definition, a priori, transdimensional or interdimensional. Now, why am I saying that? And this gets very quickly into some would say the weeds of really what I think is interesting about all of this. And that is that if you move a spacecraft and its occupants at a velocity beyond the speed of light, what I call transluminal, you are, by definition, transdimensional. And so people use these as if they are two separate things. Now, it's like two intersecting sets with a subset within it. There are experiences people have with non-physical beings, whether they be people who've had a near-death experience or angelic beings and all of that, that are purely in the so-called astral or energy fields that are non-3D physical. Now, when you take a spacecraft or their occupants and you have the technologies, and we can get into this later about what the physics, because we understand the physics behind this quite well,
Mm-hmm.
that allow for the spacecraft and the people within it who have physical three-dimensional bodies and spacecraft to move from one star system to another. You cannot do that until you go beyond the crossing point of light. And so in the mid-1990s, I wrote a paper called The Crossing Point, and it actually deals with this whole issue of the intersection between very high energy physics and non-locality consciousness, thought, and interdimensional states, because there's a place where all of that comes together. And I think that this is why, if it's something that is an interstellar and also has made its way here, I call them TDIS, transdimensional interstellars. Now, that's separate from, say, someone who has an experience with a being that does not have a 3D component, but is living in other dimensions that the mystics used to call astral, or
Right.
the worlds of light and what have you. And those are different from the things that Lockheed Martin and my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, are making. By the way, I was on a flight going to, I can't say where I was going actually, but and there was a man sitting next to me who was an engineer for my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, and we were talking about this stuff. And I didn't know this person until I sat down in the seat, and he sat down, coincidentally or not, beside me. And I said, well, at the CIA they call this WSFM. And it sounds like a radio station. He says, what's that? I said, well, it stands for Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. And he says, yes, at Northrop Grumman, we call it PFM, Pure Effing Magic. So, and it has to do with an area of science. Now, there are programs within the aerospace industry and very black projects that have been developing those technologies for the last more than 70 years. We have to remember that T. Townsend Brown was doing very high voltage experiments with crystalline materials causing levitation effects in the late 1920s. So that's, fully on over 85 years ago. So I think that when you look at what people are seeing, they're seeing all of these things. And it takes some kind of knowledge base to be able to discern whether what you're seeing is man-made but very advanced and would trick most people into people's belief that it was ET when it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it ET transdimensional interstellar? Or is someone having an experience purely with something that's from another dimension but isn't interstellar and doesn't have a home base in the 3D universe in another star system? And so this sort of discernment is needed, because if you don't, I'm a trauma doctor, and I liken this to someone coming in with chest pain into the ER, and you only have one diagnosis, a heart attack. Well, in reality, there's like 115 things that chest pain could be, one of which is a heart attack. So if we don't have enough information and we haven't studied the issue well enough to know that there's a differential, a distinction to be made, then we don't have the discernment, and then it leads to a lot of confusion, which is exactly what you see in retail. I call it retail ufology and the internet on this subject. It's mostly a very, very confusing picture. There's no reason for it to be confusing, in my opinion. It just takes some study and understanding about the physics of interstellar travel, and also understanding what kinds of technologies have been developed within sort of this parallel governmental military-industrial complex that has spent trillions of dollars of our tax money, frankly, to develop technologies that would blow your mind. And I think that's where there is a lot of confusion, because there are operations that are set up as decoys, where the average person seeing a really advanced aircraft or electronic system coming out of the Naval Research Labs or Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, any of these large entities, would absolutely be fooled and think it's ET when it isn't. So I think this is where there has to be some humility about taking a step back and saying, a lot of these events, we don't know what the point of origin is, and I think there's been a deliberate confusion that's been put out there, an obfuscation, because they'd rather people not know. I know that there have been some accidents that have happened in classified programs where they want people to believe it was ET when it wasn't. You get my drift?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that area. And you had mentioned Lockheed Martin making biological entities, and I've heard this before. I wondered if you could elaborate on that. What's the purpose? Is that some type of false flag prep, like you had kind of alluded to?
Yes. In fact, one of the things that we've tried to expose, it did not make it into the film Sirius, and those who are listening, there's a documentary that came out in the last few months called Sirius, SIRIUS, and you can link to it from our website, SiriusDisclosure.com.
Great film.
Sirius spelled like the star system. And SiriusDisclosure.com, you can look at it video on demand and get the DVD. And soon we're going to start downloading and streaming it as well. And in that film, we sort of touch on the consciousness aspects of this issue and non-locality of awareness of how contact can be made. We don't really go into this area you're asking about because the filmmaker thought it was a bridge too far for something that's an hour and 45 minutes. But
right.
If you have an audience that sort of has studied this issue some,
yes,
yeah, I think what you then have to begin to look at is what are the capabilities? And the part that gets ignored a lot, everyone talks about, well, we have anti-gravity, quote unquote, or electromagnetic gravitic, EMG, propulsion systems that are classified, and that's been well established since the 1950s, and so-called flying saucers that have been man-made. It's well known that Adolf Hitler, his secret project wasn't the atomic bomb so much as it was things that look like UFOs that are
right.
actually man-made. And that is true, absolutely true. We have photos from that era from the 40s. I think what people have overlooked is that there has been a parallel and equal development in classified biological technologies. Now, as a doctor, and I know a lot of people at Stanford and other top universities that, have had contracts with governmental entities and MIT and elsewhere. And the reality is that if you have this kind of trans-dimensional physics that you're exploring, you can begin to explore with it in biologicals as well. And you end up with some very strange stuff going on. And the really high end, what I call excuse my French, the batshit crazy end of the classified contracting world, is dealing with the biologicals. So that yes, they have been able to, for example, create creatures that look like they're ETs and they're not, put them on things that are flying saucers that look ET but they're not, and engage in false flag operations, which retail UFO subculture would call abductions and mutilations. So now some people have had actual contact with ETs, and because the the lexicon, the pop culture lexicon, is to say any contact is an abduction, even if it's not. There's been this commingling of some very virulent false information and false flag operations that deal with trying to scare the hell out of people, mixed in with people's real experiences with ETs. And when those two things get mixed up, what happens is that the fear factor kicks in, and of course you have people running around screaming, we're being invaded by aliens, which redounds to the benefit of the military-industrial complex. Ultimately, what Wernher von Braun said on his deathbed, which he was one of our, his spokeswoman for the last few years of his life, is one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, and her testimony is up at SeriousDisclosure.com for anyone to look at. There's nothing secret about any of this. It's open source on the internet now and on YouTube. What basically Wernher von Braun said was that we were going to have the Cold War, and the threat of this sort of polarity between the Soviet Union and America and the West that would then give way to global terrorism, which would then be followed by threats from outer space. And so there's been a preparatory phase since the 50s and 60s to prepare people for the idea that mainstream science says they're not out there. But then there's also a part of mainstream science saying, well, there are planets now that are like Earth. We're now estimating there are 11 billion Earth-like planets in our own galaxy. That's just come out in the last from the Kepler Space Telescope. And they'll add on to that, of course, by the way, the Lockheed guys who just wrote a book a couple years ago, but if they ever find us, they're going to come here and going to eat us for lunch. So, humans' proclivity towards the paranoia and fear of the unknown is being exploited by some very good, what's called in a Strategic Studies Institute document I have, which I wished had made it into the movie, and it didn't, and maybe it'll make it into the next one, where it talks about utilizing and hoaxing abductions and mutilations and using quote-unquote stagecraft to present a false alien threat that the world could unite around. And so in that mix, you have real ET events going on. So this begets to be very, very complicated. And, of course, we live in an era where everybody wants a really simple, quick McDonald's answer to everything. And I have bad news for people. When you get the intelligence community involved in anything, they're going to make a complicated mess out of it. And so then you have to begin to discern what part of the conventional wisdom on this subject is real, what part of it has been tailor-made stagecraft designed to create a psychological effect of fear, so that people would fear the ET, so that in the future we could sort of move into, like the movie Independence Day, yeah, let's go kick alien butt, like Will Smith says in the movie. I think that there's sort of a tendency for people to lack the patience to sift through the information and the cases to begin to understand what kinds of experiences might be ET, what might be stagecraft that is being done by humans to scare the hell out of people, what part of it might be an experience with something that isn't ET or man-made but is from another dimension, et cetera, and so on. And so this gets to be, I think, one of the central problems in the world of all things ufological, for lack of a better word. And I think that's caused a great amount of consternation and confusion. And I tend to err on the side of wanting to be very cautious and say, before you go running off and saying this event or that event was, evidence of ETs doing something horrific to humans, let's back up and study what people are capable of doing and creating a false flag operation, sort of a cosmic Gulf of Tonkin incident. Everyone forgets that in Vietnam we had the Gulf of Tonkin incident where we basically staged an attack on our own ships so that we could then justify expanding the Vietnam War, which of course enriched all the warmongers and military-industrial complex folks who are going to make trillions of dollars off that conflict. So I think we have to begin to be a little more mature in how we look at things and a little more skeptical, frankly.
Yeah, that's really well put. Now, in terms of the real ET events, I know you've worked with several governments in the Disclosure Project who have officially opened up their UFO files to you and the research teams. Of these countries and governments, which ones have made the biggest contributions, and what are some of the info that they've shared with you?
Well, I think that anything that, has been opened up to the public has been through just their archives and Air Force and sighting events like Chile and Denmark and, of course, France and even the United Kingdom have opened up things a great deal more than the United States.
Right.
But those are mainly Freedom of Information Act type or documents. It doesn't mean that there has been an opening up to the public of the really classified work, which actually there's still a lid slammed on that, both in the United Kingdom and for that matter in France, and certainly the United States. I think that there is another level where I've had the opportunity. We have about 110 hours of military and corporate testimony in the Disclosure Project. And by the way, I founded the whole global disclosure movement back in the late 90s. And it was the result of me doing some briefings for people like the CIA director and the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the ministers of defense in various countries. And what I discovered is that there was the government of we the people with our elected and appointed folks, some of whom, but very few of whom knew anything about this subject. Most of them didn't. And then there's this sort of parallel universe, as it were, of super secret black projects, so-called unacknowledged projects. And that is the proper term that's used, is unacknowledged special access projects. And we actually go into that in some detail in this film, Sirius. I think the people I've met with who are in the deep black world of unacknowledged special access projects, USAPs, the USAPs world folks are split between the people who want to keep this secret and continue to keep it secret and people who really are defecting and want this information to come out. And often I'll have a meeting with those folks. Now, they will not go on videotape because they're afraid of whatever reprisals might happen to them. But those have been my best sources for figuring out what's really going on. It puts me in a bad situation because if those people aren't willing to be name, rank, and serial number, put their name out there, then it becomes very, very difficult for me to provide to the public that information with any backup veracity. But I will say that, for example, I've met with multiple people who don't know each other, who told me the same story of being on these man-made anti-gravity devices, and they were the controllers kind of behind the curtain using these biological programmed life forms to go in and stage an abduction or stage something else. And when I first heard that back in the 90s, I thought, oh, this is just ridiculous. When I then had multiple people who had worked for various corporate and intelligence operations from various eras tell me the exact same modus operandi, I went, boy, there must be something going on here. And that's when I began to question the entire experiential database that's out there, where everything is taken as quote-unquote alien when it may or may not be. And it was sort of my coming of age of beginning to realize how nefarious and nasty the intelligence community and these para-governmental programs can be. So I think that's one of the most important things I learned from meeting with these sort of deep insight sources. The other is learning exactly where these facilities and which corporations are involved in all this. And that's one of the reasons why we put together for the president a briefing that listed all of the known corporate facilities and bases, most of which are subterranean underground, that deal with this issue that we felt that he needed to know about. And that information is something we're moving out to the public. A lot of it's now on our website on SiriusDisclosure.com. And the first person, by the way, to ask me for that, it was kind of comical, was back in the 90s. There was a member of Congress named Christopher Cox, who became Bush's head of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. And I was having a meeting with him, and he said, I'm here in Southern California. There's a lot of aerospace here. I've never heard of this issue. Where are the facilities in my district dealing with this? So I created a a file for him. And that became the sort of the thing that then grew into this larger list of facilities and operations.
Interesting. I am here in San Diego in Southern California. Where would be is there any place out there that one might go at night to try to view something if they've never had that type of experience?
Yes, well, I mean, if you go out to near Palmdale and Lancaster, and as close as you can get to the Edwards complex up in the high desert of California, in Southern California, you're going to find many people will see objects that will be launched or will be moving around very late at night. There's actually a lake bed that they keep filled with water, and there's an underground area that opens, and objects will come in and out of there at night late.
Wow.
I know people who there's a very famous rock band that has their studios down, and I'm not going to say who it is, that are a very big one, a household name band that one of them lives down there in the San Diego area, and his significant other has family members who have gone into, and I've met with them, who've gone into underground conveyors that go underneath at Edwards, deep underground, and then it connects underground all the way out to so-called Area 51, the Nellis Range, or other facilities out west, all subterranean, moving at enormous speeds using these kinds of advanced technologies. And so there's a great deal of this. But of course, getting really close to those sort of facilities, you can't, because they have ground sensors. They know if you're even walking.
Of course.
The airspace above it is restricted, and the perimeters are restricted. The real state-of-the-art facility is in outside Provo, Utah, in Dugway, the proving grounds at Dugway. And that's a very large facility that's all underground. There's very little above the surface. And, of course, also out in Australia at Pine Gap.
Right on.
So, there are these sort of facilities, and, I mean, this is why, when you look at the movie Sirius, there's a little clip in there of Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon back when he was Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush, saying there's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for.
Yeah, the day before 9/11.
And that's the day before 9/11. I tell everyone, if you don't take my word for it, look at the film and see that is Donald Rumsfeld. It's not photoshopped. It's Donald Rumsfeld himself saying this. So, and that was, you figure, a decade ago. So there's probably another 1 to 2 trillion added into that 2.3 trillion that have gone missing, quote unquote, or unaccounted for into these black projects since then. So with that kind of with these kinds of technologies and those kind of resources, you can set up a lot of deceptive operations.
Of course. God, that's fascinating. Another thing, we also hear stories of entities that have different motivations, some to raise our social consciousness and intelligence, and some apparently to harvest us. And of course, some are convinced that the planet's elite rulers are at the very least trying to conjure up or contact some multidimensional beings, if not take orders from them. But, what's your opinion on the landscape in terms of motivations and the roles of these various beings?
Well, I have to distinguish again between transdimensional interstellars that are people, I call them, for lack of a better word, intelligent life forms that are traveling amongst star systems, those that have been cleared to leave their home solar system or even their home planet environment are clearly not hostile and have reached a certain level of evolution, because if they go through the nuclear threshold like we have done and haven't achieved some level of peacefulness, they're going to blow themselves up or some other nearby neighbor before they get to our corner of the universe. I call this the evolutionary selection of non-hostility in transdimensional interstellar civilizations. But I think that's one area. Now, whether or not there are things from other that are not extraterrestrial, all right, so I'm trying to introduce this distinction here, which is the big one.
Yes.
That may be more or less enlightened. It's but I'm really talking now about the transdimensional interstellars, ETs, what I call ETs.
Okay.
I don't see there's any evidence that any of them have any sort of hostile motivation. And one of the reasons why I'm convinced of that is that if they had that ability to move amongst star systems with that level of technology, and they had any intention that way towards us, it would have been made crystal clear, and the game would have been over about the time we detonated the first atomic bomb at the Trinity site in 1945. I'm very, very skeptical of the sort of juggernaut of, the sort of duality of, well, there are good ETs and there are bad ETs, and the bad ETs look like this. One of the things I found around that whole split is that often the ones that are the bad ETs look different from us, and the good ones always tend to look like sort of Nordic people from Norway or Sweden. I find it racist, and I doubt that it has any legitimacy to it. Now, you can't prove a negative. I mean, people say prove that there aren't any, and I say, well, you can't prove a negative. What I can prove is that we're still breathing the free air of Earth. We haven't been conquered, per se, by any civilization. And I also point out that if there was a civilization out there that had, say, less than enlightened intentions towards humanity and this planet, those are the ones that we should reach out to first in what I call the CE5 diplomatic initiative. And, the thing that got me involved with this originally, and what actually led to the Disclosure Project, wasn't all the military witnesses. It was that we formed a team that went out and made contact, and this made its way up the chain of command to the head of Army intelligence and eventually the CIA director. And most people don't know this backstory, by the way. And that's really what led to the briefings that then led to the Disclosure Project happening, when I realized that the government of we the people was never going to deal with this issue properly, that we'd have to do it. But the impetus for it was that there was a small group of us that decided, let's go out and in higher states of consciousness and using the physics of thought and remote viewing and consciousness, make peaceful contact. And when we did it with that intention and without fear or prejudice, we found that, in fact, they did show up and they did come and we did have contact. And this is what got on the radar scope of the CIA director that led to the meeting. So most people don't know that. And it was actually the CE5, what I call Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, which is when, humans go out together and utilize a set of protocols. And we actually, we have a contact app, we call it, that you can get from our website that goes through the whole remote viewing training and all the protocols and everything we do. And we go out, and there are now thousands of teams all over the world, by the way, doing this. And it's, I think, creating this morphogenic field effect where we're moving towards an opening of peaceful contact. Now, really overt contact where, as Larry King asked me, why don't they land on the White House lawn? I think that's something that isn't going to happen until there's a real sea change in the mass consciousness. But it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with some pioneering people who are doing it with an understanding of the science of consciousness and where that intersects the physics of interstellar communication and transdimensional communication. So that's kind of what we specialize in doing with our contact teams. And to me, that's the most exciting part of what we're doing, one of the most exciting aspects of what we're doing. And in our experience, I've been doing this now with groups of people all over the world for over 20 years, we've never had a harmful or hostile or anything event happen involving ETs. Now, we have been shot at by humans. We've been harassed by police. We've been, we've had every kind of horrible thing happen at the hands of our fellow humans, but we've never had anything at all frightening happen from an ET source. And so what this says to me is that, for all the fear-mongering out there, which I think really just serves the CIA and the Department of Defense's secret agenda, that fear-mongering to me is trumped by the fact that we have now thousands of hours and thousands of people who've gone out doing this who've never had a negative experience. So it begins to bring up the question of, then where is all this negativity and fear coming from, and who is engendering it, and what's the agenda behind the fear? To me, the agenda behind the fear is that it's you have to create an enemy in order to get the people roused up to support a war.
I agree.
And how do you keep a $1 trillion military-industrial complex going unless you have an enemy? Leon Panetta, the CIA director, said at one point there's only 70 al-Qaeda in all of Afghanistan, and we're spending $110 billion a year there, to chase 70 al-Qaeda members. So,
right.
At a certain point you have to ask the question, how do you keep this war machine going unless you concoct, and that's what I think is happening, out of thin air, this enemy in outer space that Werner von Braun, the inventor of the rocket for Adolf Hitler, warned us about. And I
Right.
think that's unfortunately, I think there's a lot of that manipulation that's happened. So my own view of it is that a lot of the conspiracy theories about this ET group versus that ET group and this, that, and the other, I don't see the evidence for it. I think it's great if people like to be afraid and paranoid. It makes for great science fiction. I think it's very dangerous from a policy point of view. And also I point out to people that if you really do want to have something to be afraid of, you don't have to look much further than what humans are doing to each other. And as an emergency doctor, believe me when I tell you, I've seen it all. But I think that the other part of it is that if there was a threat of an unenlightened or violent or hostile civilizations from another star system, we really need to get the best and most enlightened and peacefully oriented people who are humans to go and make contact and see what can be resolved. Because
Right.
here's the existential fact no one wants to hear. If you've got the ability to travel from one star system to another, you have mastered space-time, and you have mastered the ability of technologically to take that science and weaponize it. And if you can weaponize it, you can turn the Earth into a pink mist floating through space in about a fraction of a nanosecond. Therefore, if there were, and I'm not saying there are any such civilizations that conform to this sort of internet juggernaut of good and bad aliens, but if there was, we better find a way to engage in some kind of more enlightened dialogue than running around like Chicken Little with our heads cut off.
Right.
And I think that's unfortunately most of what the response has been. But I think that is a planned response from the intelligence community. I think that people have simply been manipulated into that. But a lot of people have this as part of their belief system, and once it's like telling Jerry Falwell the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. If they want to believe that, they're going to believe it. It doesn't matter how many logical arguments you give. And so what I ultimately have to back up to is the fact that if somebody wants to think that way and believe in that very highly dualistic paradigm about life out there in the universe, then I think we need to figure out how we're going to approach that and how we're going to respond in a way that isn't going to lead to something much worse than mutual assured destruction.
Of course. A moment ago, you had used the term "cleared to leave" about beings who may have been able to get off their home planet, and a lot of researchers have alluded to the fact that ETs have developed an interest in us since we've developed the atomic weaponry, which of course makes a lot of sense. But
Right.
do you see, or have you found any research to suggest that we are on some type of interstellar quarantine here on the Earth?
Yes, absolutely. I have no doubt about it. In fact, I've said for years that if you look at our witness testimony from people like Colonel Diedrichson, who was head of the old Atomic Energy Commission, section that dealt with all our nuclear weapons facilities and uranium processing facilities, he said that every single one of them was overflown by these ET vehicles back in the late 40s, 50s, 60s when he was involved. And that they also at the same time had a very keen interest in our space program. Neil Armstrong was overheard stating, and this is in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, that when we landed on the moon, that there were all these ET craft on the crater above the Sea of Tranquility where we landed. And of course, my uncle worked on and designed the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong there. And that I've heard this from other sources, and that basically because the moonshot and the Apollo mission was really a Cold War competition, and it was really military. We always think of it as a civilian effort, but it was a very militaristic effort that we were competing with the Soviet Union in the Cold War to get to the moon first and conquer space first and have dominion in space. Well, this was viewed very negatively by the ETs because they think that people from one planet should go out in a peaceful, unified way into space, not as competing, warring factions. And so Armstrong was overheard saying that basically we were warned off the moon. So we went back a few more times, and I know Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, but then they wound down the program of going back, and it wasn't because of budget cuts, which is the fig leaf they put on the reason. The reason was that the ETs didn't want us bamming around out in space until we became peaceful. And I think that what I'm saying is that there seems to be a universal policy or doctrine that until a civilization reaches a certain level of, what Michikaku calls a level 1 civilization, where we're living together as a global community in peace on our planet, that basically until you reach that threshold, which we have not reached yet, you're really not welcome to go zapping around out there amongst other star systems or even very far to other planets where there could possibly be other facilities or life. And I think that is, in fact, what has happened. And I think we have to look at that and ask why. Well, doesn't it make sense? Let's step off the Earth for a minute and look at humanity through the eyes of ETs. In the last century, we've killed 200 million of our own people in warfare.
Yep.
All right, that's more than the population of many ET worlds in its totality, more than the population of the Earth not that long ago. So we have this unbridled ability to engage in murderous behavior coupled with weapons of mass destruction and nuclear bombs and covert so-called scalar weapons that we have developed that can travel faster than the speed of light. And I think that when you look at that, obviously there are ETs out there who are quite concerned about humans potentially being a threat to others. And I think that this kind of turns the whole, oh my God, we should be running afraid of the ETs on its head. And I think it's probably the ETs who look at us with some horror as we go around murdering each other in Syria and everywhere else. I mean, whatever the war du jour is, the Congo, 2 million people dead there, that you begin to look at this and you go, well, anyone looking at this planet would go, my God, they got a little growing up to do before they go bamming around out amongst the stars.
Well, let me ask you a little follow-up about the moon, because I was hoping that China getting a rover on the moon might expose something that the Americans had not disclosed. Obviously, you're of the opinion that the universe is full of life. Have you been presented with any interesting information about beings on the moon or bases on Mars or in any other areas of our solar system?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, the head of Army Intelligence told me very directly that they had imaged underneath the surface of Mars operational ET facilities, not on the surface. And I have also, as you know, from Carl Wolf's testimony, who's a Disclosure Project witness, that when we were doing the digital imaging of the moon prior to the lunar landing, the lunar orbiter, which was going around taking pictures, the early digital pictures, did image both new and ancient structures that were on Mars, mainly in the terminator section. Now, the terminator section is the section between the dark and the light side of the moon. And now, interestingly, that's not where the Chinese are. But I think that if I was talking to Elon Musk or the Chinese, and where I was going to put something down, I would put something down around the terminator, around the area that's called the terminator area, where it's sort of the twilight area between the dark and the light side of the moon, and that's where apparently there's a clustering of facilities.
And something I had heard you once say, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the roles or these different types of beings. These maybe different species is the right term, but I've heard you mention that, for example, one of the roles is like creating a Noah's Ark of the Earth, harvesting everything to have some type of DNA bank somewhere out there.
Right.
What are some other examples of things that ETs are actually trying to do with us?
Well, what I've observed, and this is something we started to piece together in the early 90s, is that there are certain categories. There seem to be some ET operations that deal with an acculturation, introducing themselves to people and being seen, even people having contact experiences, what have you. Some very intimate and very prolonged that really do happen. Another part seems to be very scientific. The very famous case that you have in France that was in the Cometa report, a group of generals and scientists in France, some of whom I know, put together this report. And one of the cases was the Provence case, where this ET craft landed in a lavender field. And the farmer comes out at 3 in the morning, and here are all these little guys, these little ETs, 3 or 4 feet tall, picking lavender, taking them back on the spacecraft, taking samples from his field. Now, this actually left a landing trace, which was documented by Japan, their space agency, and it's a very solid landing case that no one has contested as a fraud. But what were the ETs doing? They seemed to be doing sampling. When I was in Belgium, I noticed that we had a contact with one of these massive craft, that there were reports that we had from the gendarme that they were actually seen putting some kind of sensor system down that looked like a laser. And when they mapped where it was over the old fault line system. And if you go to these little towns in Belgium, a lot of the old buildings are held together by earthquake bolts. People forget there have been some terrible earthquakes in Europe in the not-so-distant past. But it turns out 70% of the French electric grid and Belgium is getting their energy off of nuclear power plants, and unfortunately they put most of them right on these earthquake faults. And apparently the ETs were monitoring and checking into that because they saw that as something that was a risk. Another area that I found that's very common, if you go to Popocatépetl and the other volcanoes around in the Philippines, all over the world, the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, there are Mount Unjin in Japan. You see these amazing videos and photos of ET craft going in and out of these volcanoes and around these very unstable areas, because I think that they're examining how the so-called Ring of Fire is becoming increasingly unstable. And I think that as we melt billions of tons of ice off of both of our polar axes of a spinning top, the Earth going through space at 1,000 miles per hour, there's the risk that there could be a big Earth change event, or there could be a release of an enormous event that would be along the Pacific Ring of Fire that could, trigger massive tsunamis and massive destruction. And we have found that whenever there's been an eruption of a volcanic area or a major earthquake, there have been consistent reports of sightings of these ET craft around those facilities, seeing what's going on, and perhaps maybe even trying to stabilize the areas. We don't know. That's getting into some speculation. But there's certainly been a temporal relationship between those sort of events. So you find that there are a certain number of operations that seem to be scientific. Some may be where they're making preparations, because there's a Chinese saying, unless we change directions, we're likely to end up where we're going. And, for 50 to 100 years, we've been moving in a very bad direction towards increasing conflict, environmental degradation, increasing weapons of mass destruction with greater and greater destructive capability. So it very well could be, and maybe I'm speculating some here, that there are ETs out there that are observing this and making preparatory plans if it goes to a worst-case scenario, or just trying to document what we're doing geophysically, but also what we're doing geopolitically. And I think that there's been, like Colonel Diedrichson said, there's an unmistakable clustering of ETs around our nuclear silos and facilities where they were obviously concerned what we were doing, and around our space program, and around these geophysical active areas. And then there's another category. I have a man who's Navy intelligence who's on my team who was on a submarine that was sent down to the South Atlantic, to examine the euphemism of electromagnetic anomalies under the ocean. And what they found, they went down there really to hunt for UFOs underwater. And they were clearly ET craft that were underwater that were doing scientific examinations under the oceans and taking samplings. But at one point, one of these craft came over to this huge nuclear submarine and was able to take its drive system completely offline. In other words, they couldn't go up or down, forward, back, nowhere, side to side. They were just suspended in this force field. It was fascinating. Damn. And they were, this guy was on this submarine and he was collecting all this data. They collected all this electronic data. But he said what was interesting is that at one point they tracked one of these objects moving underwater without causing any wake at 450 knots. Now that's the speed of a Learjet. So,
wow.
And so it's quite interesting. He didn't understand how there could be no displacement of water as it moved at that speed. And I said, well, that's the physics behind, when you adjust for zero gravity and you're dealing with a mass cancellation effect from the physics of very high voltage systems that do this. But so they do move through the air without a sonic boom, and they move through the water without creating a wake. But just like, a sharp knife through melted butter, just straight through, but literally at hundreds of miles per hour, and then disappear in the water. So it was fascinating to hear, this account about what they were doing even under the oceans, that usually people don't even think about.
Yeah. I mean, these crafts are so interesting, but, I'm really intrigued by what I hear less about is the physical characteristics of these beings. I mean, some people in the Disclosure Project have gone into it. You hear about the typical grays, the Nordic type beings that you had mentioned earlier. There's stories of reptilian types, but what type of entities can you talk about that you've seen enough evidence to believe actually exist that are slightly different looking than human?
Well, there are a lot. I mean, there's some that are incredibly small, and there's some that are incredibly tall. We've had on our CE5 expeditions beings come in transdimensionally. There's a photograph of one that's on our at SiriusDisclosure.com that happened at Joshua Tree, and that's not far from you.
I saw that picture.
And it looks very human-like. Somewhat different, a very different formation of the head, had some concave areas in the forehead area, and so they range from, and of course there's this controversy about what's in the film with this so-called Atacama humanoid, where some people have said, oh well, what is this thing? It's a 6 to 8 year old child that's only 6 inches tall, which means the adults would only be a foot or so. But now we're finding there are reports out of Russia and other places of these beings being seen, and they're literally these tiny humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, beings that are less than a foot tall when they're adults, and others that have been reported that are in the 30 to 35 feet tall range, and there are apparently skeletal remains. I know Paula Harris is looking into this in Sardinia and other places. Where there remains. So there's no reason why, given the immensity of the cosmos, and even mainstream science now saying that there's a likely 11 billion Earth-like planets just in our own galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy is just one of billions of galaxies, that there wouldn't be enormous diversity in size, shape, form, what have you. I think the caricature in the UFO subculture of the 2 or 3 types is mostly well, again, I think it's caricature, and I'm not so sure that some of those forms aren't actually the so-called programmed life forms or PLFs that are man-made. And I think that this gets into where it's what's more useful if people would get out of their armchairs and out from in front of the television and their computer and form a contact team. And it's easy to do. You can download this app from our site. It goes through the whole protocols. We have people who, we had a Croatian truck driver who did this with some people in Croatia and had a contact where this craft floated right over his truck. And he was a lorry driver and had amazing contact experiences. I think if people would actually engage in real time rather than internet speculation, they might learn a lot more. Of course, that takes more effort than just surfing the net and then being a couch potato.
Right.
Everyone wants to be a couch potato and do nothing and then have these wild opinions. My view of it is that it's more useful to go out and actually do the hard work of and it's actually not hard work, it's fun because you're out under the stars with friends and you don't need a lot of people. I've done this. I recently did it up near Joshua Tree with 500 people out under the stars, but you can do it with 3 or 4 people that you are like-minded with, and it's an amazing experience that you begin to have in meditation, remote viewing, cosmic consciousness, things that begin to appear all around you. And it isn't just a physical manifestation. Sometimes, if it doesn't seem like it's safe for the ETs to come, because there's a lot of military that might pick up on their presence and shoot at them, we found that we'll start having electronic anomalies and electronic devices that will start signaling in a very intelligent way, in a way that some detector isn't manufactured to even be able to make that sound. And the ETs will start communicating through our electronics in bizarre ways. So there are all kinds of fascinating things that happen that I tell people it's actually more bizarre than anything that you would read or see in a movie, and fun. I mean, it's amazingly fun to do it.
You really got me wanting to join one of these teams, and I think I'm going to look into it. But one more question about the crazy speculation that one of the most fascinating things. I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't at least ask you about it. But
Sure.
the most far out thing I had ever heard is beings that use like a type of photosynthesis, like a plant-like being, or like even feline beings. Now, do you think these are exaggerations, or have you ever seen anything to suggest that those are real type of beings?
Yeah, we have had contact with ones that are like feline beings that look lion-like. We've had like bird ones that have very similar characteristics to birds, but that are
Wow.
humanoid. We've had contact with ones that are very cetacean-looking, that are almost like a whale head type being and a very thick body, but that are upright. I think that if you look at any kind of life form, it has the potential to evolve into a humanoid head, two arm, two leg type creature. And multiple people on our teams who don't even know this, because I don't speak of it publicly much, have had contact with these species that looks very much like a humanoid praying mantis, and they're incredibly gentle, and they're noted to be amazing healers, by the way. They have this
Wow.
healing ability. And a number of people have had contact with those and on our contact teams, but they have never heard of it, and they'll share it, and it is exactly what multiple people. In fact, my assistant for years, Sherry Adamak, who was murdered helping us do this, there were 3 people who were killed back in the 90s when we were trying to do all this disclosure work. My right-hand assistant and a former CIA director, Bill Colby, and a member of Congress, Schiff. And it's a long story, but when she was dying, one of these praying mantis-type beings materialized in her house and put her in a state. Now, she wasn't healed, but she never had any pain. She died of this horrible metastatic cancer, which, by the way, all of us got. It was a bizarre thing. Everyone on my team got this a metastatic cancer that was fatal, and I'm the only one that survived. But
Damn.
she never had any pain, and I was with her at the time of her death. And that story is in Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which is kind of an autobiography I wrote that is the basis for this film, Sirius. But it's a beautiful story of spiritual contact with these beings and the capabilities they have.
That's awesome.
And so there's a huge diversity out there of these sort of life forms, and I have found that the ones that people are always describing, these thousands of people who are on our team all over the world never see, and there are all these others that you never hear about because I think the intelligence community doesn't want you to hear about them.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I appreciate you sharing that with us. Kind of one other thing I wanted to touch on was the current state of disclosure. I mean, conspiracy researchers are always saying things like we're running out of time, economic collapse is coming, earth changes are coming, disclosure's coming. And I've heard that over the years you've been to some high-profile meetings trying to bring this stuff through the right channels, and we're still waiting. So give us the 411 on the current state of disclosure in terms of both these otherworldly beings and the implementation of this technology. How close are we to overcoming this petrodollar control grid?
Well, the first thing to understand is that the ETs are waiting for us to be ready for a more open event.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is, as I said, we have to reach a certain level of collective enlightenment and peace before there's going to be massive overt contact. So that's just a reality, a conscious evolution reality. In terms of the government, the thing that I keep saying to people is that more than half the population thinks that UFOs are real. 43% of the American population, a poll in the last year, think that we're currently being visited. More than 2/3 of the population of the world believes there's intelligent life out there. The Disclosure Project materials, witnesses, and information is more known than most people realize, even in very elite circles, but people don't want to admit it. And so I tell people we've done that. So there's 2 disclosures. There's the disclosure that I left my medical career to do because I saw that the government was going to do nothing. And there's what everyone else is calling a disclosure event, which meaning that the mainstream governments disclose something. that's a very much less likely event until something unmistakable happens that they then have to address the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because when, for example, when I briefed the CIA director, and recently I briefed the senior officials in France who do all the advisories for the president of France, and back when Sarkozy was president, his senior guys came over to Washington. We had very long meetings. What I found was that the people that you're thinking are going to do something with disclosing information don't have access control. Now, what do I mean by access control? Access control means that they have access to these black projects and also control over them. Those are two separate things. So, for example, in the briefing that I put together that went through the chain of command and was given to Obama after he became president, it has a document from the 90s that lists the code numbers and project code names of a lot of the compartmented super secret operations. And then there was this packet I described a little while ago that listed all the facilities and corporations and compartments that were involved and where they were and what the sub-facility was named out at this range, blah, blah, blah. But him knowing that and him having access or control over them are two very different things. Now you add in a third question, and that who has the courage to step into the buzzsaw to take this issue on? Because the media, which is not a free press, is going to ridicule any political figure that touches this. I mean, I've been called every name in the book.
Right.
And then on top of it, you have the fear factor. So, after I briefed Clinton's CIA director on this, one of his best friends came to my house. Not the CIA director's best friends, but the President Clinton's best friends came to my house and sat around my table with my wife and kids and said, well, they're very supportive of what you're recommending about the disclosure and ending secrecy, but they're convinced that if the president does this, he'll end up like Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
And I started laughing. I thought this was a joke. And he stopped me. He says, no, they're serious. And I said, you're telling me that you can't protect the President of the United States, and what am I? And he said, well, you should do it. And I basically later pulled him aside and I said, well, what you're really saying is that I'm expendable. And he says, yes, you're expendable because you're not important. Very harsh Washington mindset. I said, fine, I agree, I'm not important and I'm expendable. So I'm the throwaway guy. I'm the guy. It doesn't matter if, how vilified I am or if I'm hated or liked or whatever. But these politicians, they're afraid of this secret government group that has more power than you can imagine. And what they realize, and this is what Clinton said years later, he said, the White House was the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system. You're basically in prison there. So people have this wrong idea that just because you're the President of the United States or the President of France or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that you have an all-access pass and that you actually have control over these operations. They don't realize that what Eisenhower warned us about, beware of the military-industrial complex because it will get out of control, be a threat to our democracy, came to pass. It had already come to pass when he gave that speech in January of 1961, right before Jack Kennedy went into office. And so for 50 years, we have been living in an era, over 50 years, where the people that we think are in charge of all this stuff really are, I hate to say it, fairly clueless. Mm-hmm. And even if they find out about it, which is what I've done the best I can do as a civilian, to help them find out and to be their sort of Sherpa through this wilderness and guide. I'm the cosmic Sherpa. They end up discovering that they don't have control over this group, and this group, this what used to be called Majestic, and I understand there's a new name for it now, SECOR, SECOR, that this group really has more technology and more power than the President or the Senate Intelligence Committee, and therefore hold the trump card. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you a little story. So I'll make it as short as possible.
Sure.
I was with this guy who was the what they call J2, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, and an admiral. And he had asked to receive what's called a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon, and I agreed to go, and I brought astronaut Edgar Mitchell along with me, and some of our disclosure witnesses and people who were insiders who knew of the subject. And before the briefing, I had sent ahead of time by courier a packet that included some of these documents, and he recognized in one of these documents an operation that he had heard of but didn't know what they were doing. And it was related to UFOs and ETs. And he contacted this compartmented, numbered entity, and it was being run by a contractor. And he said, look, this is Admiral so-and-so, and I want to be briefed. He used the word read into, which is the Pentagon speak. I want to be read into this project. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, yes, sir, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know. And the Admiral, I mean, this is the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States of America. And the Admiral goes, well, God damn it, if I don't have a need to know, who does? And they said, sir, we cannot discuss this with you. And he was furious, and they just basically hung up on him and blocked his line thereafter. So by the time I get to this briefing, and here I am with a man who walked on the moon and all these top secret guys who knew about this stuff, this Admiral is so scared and so angry, and not angry at me, but angry at this situation. And it was supposed to be like a 20-minute stand-up briefing. You know, when you're dealing with someone at that level of government, it tends to be very crisp. It went on for over 2 hours. And in fact, if Edgar Mitchell hadn't had a TV interview up in New York, it would have gone on for longer. The Admiral kept canceling things downstream and said, I've got to hear this. So by the end of the meeting, I said, you know, Admiral, we really need your help getting control over this operation and helping us with disclosing this information, because we've got to bring out these sciences and technologies for peaceful use. We've got to get this problem in our democracy, this cancer that's destroying our democracy, fixed. And he looked at me, he said, how do I do anything? Because if I don't have an order from the Secretary of Defense and the President, I would be going rogue, which is the problem with the group that's gone rogue. Yeah. And number two, and this is what was very chilling, he says, the best thing I know about in my arsenal is a B-2 stealth bomber. And I've learned today that there's a secret Air Force that have things that can do circles around my B-2 stealth bombers. What am I going to do? It's point, set, match. It was a very chilling sort of existential crisis that you know I was involved with. And a similar thing happened after I briefed the CIA director. At the very end of the meeting, the CIA director, I turned to him and I give him this sort of white paper that's in my very first book, that you can get on SeriousDisclosure.com. And in this set of recommendations, it has all these things that I think the President and he ought to do. And you know, it's a very long meeting. Again, we thought it'd be a brief meeting. It goes on for almost 3 hours. And I turned to him and I said, look, we really need your help getting the disclosure on this and bringing this out. And he looked at me, he says, well, how does the President and how do I disclose something we have no access to? Mm-hmm. And he wasn't kidding. He was not joking when he said, we don't have access. So it's so dysfunctional. So to answer your question, the action is going to come from we the people. I'm sitting here down the road from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and the we the people. And I think, my farm here in Virginia, and what I feel is that people have to empower themselves to find more of these whistleblowers, people to come out with credible documents and information. We the people need to make contact. We the people have to do disclosure. And finally, which is the thing, it's been the hardest thing for us to do, we the people need to bring together the funding and the brain trust of scientists and researchers to bring out these technologies that could get us off oil and gas and coal. Because when the day is done, this whole issue and the secrecy around it is about macroeconomic power. This is what Paul Hellyer, the Minister of Defense of Canada, and I've spoken about at some press conferences, that it's really about who runs the world, who has the power, the technologies of how these UFOs, whether they're man-made or interstellar, are moving. They are not using fossil fuels. They are not using rockets from the 40s. They're not using what Elon Musk is doing at SpaceX, which is just a fancier version of what Werner von Braun had in the 40s for Hitler. It's very advanced, trans-dimensional physics. And until those sciences are liberated from the yoke of this sort of fascist petro-Nazi regime, the world is going to continue to deteriorate, and so is the body politic and our democracy. And so that's the thing that and people say, well, when is the government or the corporations going to release this stuff? I say, but sometime between now and never.
Yeah.
I think we the people need to figure out, how do we do our own civilian open source, no patents, no trade secret program to bring these technologies out and develop them free from the venture capital crowd and free from the big government crowd, who ultimately, if you have the big money and people involved who own the technology, they're going to sell out to the highest bidder.
Right. But it's
which is going to put it back. It's going to put it back on a black shelf. So this is really where the rubber meets the road, where we have to figure out what do we want to do when we grow up. and it's like it's sitting around passively expecting the government and these large corporations to do anything constructive. I don't mean to sound cynical, but I think, having dealt with the government at the level I have for 20 years, I keep saying we, the people, have to take responsibility for this and have to actually take action and go from information and sort of being entertained by this issue, and it is entertaining and it is interesting, to actually doing constructive things like going out and making contact, going out and developing these technologies, and going out and spreading the word about disclosure, but also finding more and more people who are credible to disclose the information about what's going on at Edwards, what's going on at the Dugway Proving Grounds, what's going on inside the black projects at Lockheed Skunk Works.
Right.
I mean, this is exactly what we need to do, and it needs to be sort of an awakening globally on this issue. And I think that that's really how it's going to happen. Now, it isn't to say that at a certain point of us, we the people, doing that there's the possibility of a capitulation from these covert interests and the mainstream government. Or at a certain point, now this sounds a little spookier, but at a certain point where we begin to degrade our civilization and our biosphere so far, there may be an overt event that the ETs do. But I think that's kind of the last stop on the F train. It would be much better if, in other words, you're fucked at that point, excuse my French. But
it's okay here.
Because because ultimately, if you're codependently expecting the ETs to land and fix this mess, this is delusional. It's like expecting that we're going to land in Afghanistan and turn a feudal society into a Jeffersonian democracy in a decade. Well, this is ludicrous. It doesn't happen that way. So the ETs, I mean, the kind of thing that some people think might happen, it could happen that way, but it would happen under some worst-case scenarios. And so I tell people, look, we can become enlightened, we can awaken and join together and take constructive action, we can do contact together, we can do disclosure together, and we can bring out these technologies together. And behind the scenes, there will be some pretty mysterious, cool things that the ETs have helped us with. I wouldn't have gotten this far without some really weird, amazing things that have protected and helped us. But at the same time, it's a big mistake to think that, we're the children of planet Earth, and I think the ETs view us as being responsible for this planet, and so we need to start taking responsibility. I don't think, however, when I meet with people in Washington, even the people open to this and who are supportive of disclosure and bringing out these technologies, they're mostly politicians and bureaucrats, and they don't have the courage to go up against this majestic 12 or this secret cabal. They just don't want to they don't want to go into the buzzsaw, as Gore Vidal, wrote the foreword to the book Into the Buzzsaw years ago about the journalists and other people whose lives have been destroyed by taking on these powerful interests. When Gore Vidal talked about that, he says very few people want to go voluntarily into that buzzsaw, which is what I've done. But I think that, so when you look at Washington and you look at the power elite, the wealthy, the politically powerful and connected, they just want to maintain what they have and get more power and money. They don't want to take on something that isn't going to redound to their own personal ambition and glory, which is why, for the most part, the ruling class never is responsible for the big changes in history. If you look at history, it's almost never where the power of center is that the change comes from. It comes from the periphery, from we the people. And that's true of every revolution.
Right. Well, I mean, I totally agree with that analysis, but it's such a tall order to topple the ultimate control machine. But this kind of brings me to one of my last questions. You mentioned that the president couldn't talk about it, and so how is it you're allowed to operate at this level? Because we've had reporters like Michael Hastings killed for what seems to be a lot less than this high-level information. I mean, you're meeting with high-ranking officials. Some seem to be behind you, others against, but how are you allowed to talk about these kind of things and be in the forefront without being snuffed out?
Well, you're assuming that attempts haven't been made to do that.
Well, right. But I mean, they should be able to do it if they wanted to.
Sure. And I think that the reason for it is that there are a group of people who support what we're trying to do, who have significant influence. And so it's interesting, when I first got involved with this, I was told by two separate people who didn't know each other that only about a third of Majestic at all supported what I was recommending back in the 90s. I was told not long ago 70% of that control group is now supportive. Now, the other 30% will eat their own and kill their own, which is what happened to Bill Colby, the CIA director who was killed after he was going to give my group an operational, quote-unquote, free energy device, because he had been, part of this cabal. Some CIA directors knew about this stuff and some didn't. But I think that what that means is that there are people who, they have an interest in seeing that this is dealt with properly. They can't, if they step off the reservation too far because they're in the system, there's a big risk they will be killed. I, on the other hand, well, as this guy said, I'm not important. So as a civilian, I'm a doctor who's chosen this path. I've taken no oaths to anyone. I don't have any security clearances. I don't want any. I've been offered them. I don't want them. I will not. By the way, all these meetings I've had have been completely open without any security clearances by me or anyone I brought into the meeting happened to be signed. So, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And I think that, but because that's the only way I will do one. Okay. And so if someone wants the information we have, that's the ticket to get in. I'll do it for free, and I'll go anywhere in the world. And I have. Recently, I was just all the way over in it was 23 hours of flying to get to a remote island where there were 120 leaders from around the world meeting. I was asked by the founders of this sort of like a really elite Davos type thing to do a presentation. So I went there for free and did it. And now I'll tell you, about half the people on that island I think wanted to hurl me into the ocean and kill me. But the other half were, maybe open-minded, and maybe 10 or 20% were really supportive. But ultimately, I think that, being able to thread this needle, which is what I've been trying to do, is a balance that I have to strike. But there are very, very good people who support this. And I think it's a mistake to believe that the CIA and the Pentagon and covert programs and some of these even big corporations don't have people who very much want to see us do the right thing here. So there are people who are, and they're very protective. So I think people want to sort of paint everything with one brush. And unfortunately, the human situation is more complex than that.
That's a fair answer. Well, hey, man, all right. That pretty much brings us to the end of the show. I really respect and appreciate your role in this whole realm of secrecy. I know you face a lot of criticism and skepticism, but that happens to anyone who's at the top of their field. So thanks for sharing all that juicy info with us. It's been a blast. Would you like to fill the people in on what Dr. Greer is working on currently and where they can keep up with you?
Yeah, if people go to SiriusDisclosure.com, it's SIRIUS disclosure.com, you can sign up for free and get our mailings and information of what's going on. And I also have a Twitter feed at Dr. Stephen Greer, and also a Facebook page, Sirius the Movie, on Facebook. And people can see the film online, and they can also get involved in these contact groups and get the contact app. There's a link there on the website. And this coming year, in the next few months, we're going to come out with a free app so that everyone who wants to be part of a team can be in a social network where they'll see where everyone else is and can link up with them.
Awesome.
And so that we're developing now. We have a volunteer. Now I have to keep in mind everything we've done has been without an office, a staff, or any real funding. So, it's sort of being done by a volunteer. We don't have a hard date for releasing that. And we're going to do a number of expeditions coming up this year where we're going to go out into the stars where I'll lead a group of people. And, it's likely going to be in California, Arizona, a few other places.
Nice.
So,
can people get involved in that?
Oh, yeah. It's open to anyone to register and come. And they can find out about it again if they just sign up at SeriousDisclosure.com. It's
Awesome.
free, and you can get our newsletter and information as we have events happening. We'll notify you.
Cool, man. Well, thanks again. Keep doing what you do, and hopefully sometime soon we'll see some mainstream movement on this disclosure issue.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
All right, man. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, people.
You